Hello everyone, welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide Series where I talk about the strategical side of the Unmatched board game. This is Volume 2 about basic cards. I highly recommend going back and watching Volume 1 about Feint if you have not seen that already. But if you are too lazy to or somehow unable to click away from this video, I will understand and not judge you. So the question I have to answer before we get into the meaty topics of this video are, what are basic cards and why do they exist? So I classify basic cards as any card in a deck that has a simple effect and also appears in multiple decks. These are very easy to understand and they're common enough to remember. When your opponent plays one, you can say, oh, I know what that card does because that card is also in my deck. These are a really good tool for new players to help them learn the game, recognize cards between decks, and start building up to higher level strategies. And I would consider them a big foundation in learning how to play the game. So I'm going to talk about 3 specific basic cards in this video. However, I would like to point out that Feint from my last video is also a basic card. But I wanted to talk about Feint specifically in its own video because of its importance in the overall meta of the game. So anyway, the first card I want to talk about is Regroup. Regroup, as you can see here, is a 1 value any card, and it's versatile. It has the text, after combat, draw 1 card. If you won the combat, draw 2 cards instead. And its boost value changes based on what deck that is, but we can get into that in a second. And usually decks have 3 copies of this. And it appears in 8 decks. It appears in every character from Battle of Legends, both Bigfoot and Robin Hood, the Bruce Lee deck, and it appears in Robert Muldoon's deck, which is also known as InGen, but I like calling that deck Muldoon just because Muldoon's a fucking badass. So anyway, Regroup is, in terms of power quality, a very poor card, and that is intentional. If every card in your deck was really good, that would be overpowered. So in order for there to be good cards in your deck, there also have to be bad cards. And Regroup is a tool that lets the designers of this game kind of give you more strength. And then this, of course, is the balance to that. A little bit of sacrifice of power. But it is a necessary evil, if you will. Like I said before, every deck that has it has 3 copies. And the boost is different for King Arthur, Sinbad, and Muldoon because those decks have a little bit... They can do more with the boost value on their cards, so it makes sense that they have this as a lower boost because a 2 boost would actually kind of be good in those decks, and Regroup is not supposed to be a good card, so they made it 1 boost for those. This card is useful as fodder, and by fodder I mean if you need to boost to move, if you need an extra 1 or 2 spaces to close out on an enemy to attack them this turn, it's good. It's a really good card to discard. If you have to discard a card, either by an opponent saying you have to or you're at the hand limit, this is also a good card to discard because it is quite poor. So now that's like the abstract use for it. If we take a look at what the card actually does, the after combat effect where it draws a card is actually not terrible because that means this card replaces itself, which overall, if you look at like the action economy of your turn, each turn you have 2 actions. Most of the time you'll be maneuvering, which is actually less about moving and more about drawing cards. And if your cards in your hand and if you have cards that say draw a card on them, that's really good because they replace themselves and you kind of save like an action or half an action because they cost an action to draw, but they kind of give you an action back when you play it. So it's action neutral. If you look at it from that perspective. And if you actually win the combat with this card, you draw 2 cards, which actually means you're gaining an action. So this is like an action positive card because now you have 2 cards, but you only paid 1 action for it. But as you'll see in a couple seconds, I guess, you usually will not win the combat with this card unless something goes terribly wrong. You should not use this card for defense. If you have this card in your hand, you should not be thinking to yourself, okay, I have this. I have a regroup in my hand. I can block whatever the enemy throws at me this turn. It is not good at defense because blocking 1 damage is literally the last step on the ladder above blocking 0 damage. Although 1 damage can be the difference in some games between living and dying, just because it's better than nothing doesn't mean it's good. You should probably try to have more than this in your hand if you're going to be defending on your opponent's next turn. But if you have to play this on defense, I guess it is better than nothing because you'll get to cycle a card. But usually you shouldn't put yourself in a situation where you have to block with this card. It actually is not terrible on offense, besides the fact that you will probably not do any damage to your opponent. It's good for a few reasons. First of which is that a lot of times in this game, and I say a lot, probably like 95% of the time, on defense, you're going to want to block your opponent's attack because each deck has a few attacks that if they hit you, they'll eat a large chunk of damage. So that usually mandates a block if you can. But if you're attacking with this card, your opponent doesn't know that you're throwing a tiny pebble at them. They could be thinking that you're using your huge big attack. So they might waste a really good block card on a regroup. And regroup, as I've mentioned probably a few times already, is quite poor. So if you make your opponent waste a good card from you playing a bad card, that's actually pretty good. So even if you're putting down a 1 value attack, you can still get some value out of it. The other thing is card advantage. This card, as I said before, replaces itself, which means that at the end of combat, you'll have the same amount of cards that you started with, but your opponent will have 1 less. So there's a concept called card advantage, which is basically in this game, you generally want to have more cards than your opponent at all times because the more cards you have, that's like the more options you have for attacking and defending. And if you have more than your opponent, you usually can do more in that scenario. And you'll typically have more options, and that it's just generally like a good thing. If you had 7 cards and your opponent had 2 cards, that's like a very stark comparison, and it should kind of be obvious to see why that is good. I feel like I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but generally more cards is better, and if you have more cards than your opponent, that's also good. And so this helps you maintain card advantage, or at least it doesn't hurt your hand from attacking, because normally after you attack, you're at 1 less card. However, attacking with this card is not good if for some reason your opponent has good effects attached onto their defense cards, because they will essentially get that effect for free because you won't be doing any damage to them. Or if they play a regroup and they win the combat because you don't deal any damage off the attack, then defending, they'll win the combat and get 2 cards, in which case they'll have card advantage and you will not. And that is probably the worst case scenario, which would make attacking with regroup phenomenally bad in that sense, but you won't know that at the start of combat. So overall, this is a pretty bad card with some specific scenarios where it's not terrible, although generally you're going to want to use this to bait out your enemy's block cards, and that's about it. The next card I want to talk about is Skirmish. Skirmish is a versatile 4-value any card that says, after combat, if you won the combat, choose one of the fighters in the combat and move them up to 2 spaces. And it appears in 5 decks: Alice, King Arthur, Bigfoot, Bruce Lee, and Jekyll and Hyde. So all decks with this card in it have 3 copies, except for Alice, which has 2, and all the decks that use this are melee fighters. This is important because the after combat effect of moving is very strong, especially for melee fighters. A lot of times, melee fighters' turns will look like this. They'll take a maneuver action to move closer to the enemy, and then they'll use their second action to attack. This leaves them vulnerable because starting your turn right next to the enemy means they could potentially attack you twice, and that's usually not good. You want to give your opponent as minimal opportunities to attack you as possible. But this card says after combat, you can move away, which is very good because now that means your opponent has to move and then attack you, unless of course they're a ranged fighter. But most of the fighters in this game are melee, so it's a generalization that I think will be true most of the time. So if you can move away after you attack, that gives you a really good advantage for the next turn. And it does say if you won the combat, but usually block cards in this game are around 3 value. So I think generally you'll probably win at least 50% of the time, if not a little bit more. So I think the effect will probably go off more often than not. It is a value 4, so it's quite good on both sides of offense and defense. The effect is generally better used on offense, like I just described. You move in, attack, and then use the effect to move away. But the value is probably better on defense because a 4 on offense is not as good as a 4 on defense. Generally, attack cards have higher values than defend cards because if they made a bunch of overpowered defense cards, you wouldn't be able to kill that character, and that would feel very sluggish and bad to play against. So they generally kind of beef up the offense cards so that eventually the game will end and someone will kill the other person. So having a higher value on defense is probably better than on offense, but the effect is probably better on the offensive side. However, using this on defense would let you move when it's not your turn. It would give you an opportunity to put yourself in a good position to start your turn, which for some characters might be pretty good. Like if someone's attacking you with one, like their sidekick, you could use this, and then if you win, you could move 2 spaces to their hero and then attack their hero instead on your turn. So something like that. And this card is especially good on Jekyll and Hyde because out of the 5 characters that I mentioned, Jekyll and Hyde gets penalized the most for moving because as Hyde, you take 1 point of damage every single time you maneuver. So cards in his deck that let him move without taking a maneuver action are very good, but I'll get more into that when I make the video on him specifically. And there is a card called Leap Away, which appears in the Sinbad and Muldoon decks that is essentially this card, except the value for moving is 4 instead of 2. Those are 2 characters that benefit very greatly off of the extra mobility, so it's a much better card in their decks. However, the effect of moving after combat is very strong in melee fighter decks, which makes it a pretty good card in all the decks that it is in. And the last card I want to talk about is Momentous Shift. Momentous Shift is a 3-value versatile any card that says, during combat, if your fighter started this turn in a different space, this card's value is 5 instead. And it appears in Alice, King Arthur, Sinbad, Bigfoot, and Bruce Lee's decks. Every deck has 3 copies, except for Alice, who again only has 2 copies of it, and every single deck that has this is a melee fighter. This is a variably good attack when used at 5. Like I said earlier in the skirmish section, generally defense cards are around 3. So if you're attacking with 5, you're going to do probably 1 or 2 points of damage. And basically an attack that has a value of 5 is a pretty good attack. The only thing better is an attack with a value of 6, but that only appears in select decks, or an attack that can greatly increase the value of the attack through various means. Most of the time it's discarding cards like Wolf Form or Forever Hide. However, the thing that makes it variably good, and not just good, is that this card it has a few weaknesses. It is very telegraphed because you have to start your turn in a different space, which means your opponent will always know when a momentous shift would activate. They would never know like if you were actually playing it or if you even had it in your hand, but they would know if you moved and then attacked them. While they're choosing what block card to play, they're thinking, oh, he could be playing a momentous shift because he moved this turn. And it is very vulnerable to cancels. As I mentioned in the feint video, if you feint this card, you're essentially blocking for 4 damage because it takes away the 2 via the cancel, and then it just blocks 2, so you only deal 1 damage. But on offense, generally, if this is not canceled, it's a pretty good attack. However, you should also be aware that in the very rare case that you can activate it defensively, you probably should. If you have no better block options in your hand, because a block card with a value 5 is a very good block. 4 is very good, as I mentioned with Skirmish, so 5 is even better than that. However, you should not let your opponent be able to activate it defensively. Cards like Skirmish, where you can move either fighter, if you're going to use a card like Skirmish on like a sidekick or something, and then move the enemy towards your hero to attack them with both your sidekick and your hero in the same turn, you should be aware that you might be activating an opponent's momentous shift on defense, which would be pretty bad. And in a pinch, you can use this as a 3-value block card with no effect. That's not terrible. It's probably not the most ideal use of this card damage-wise, but if you have no other options, it's fine for you to block this card. Now it's time for my final thoughts on basic cards. Overall, Regroup is a card that needs to exist so that the amazing cards in your deck feel balanced when you play them. Knowing that you have kind of shit tier cards makes the fact that you have super cards even better, and it makes it so that your opponent isn't completely overwhelmed with the strength of your cards the whole game. And Regroup specifically, it is a bad card, but the design of it is very interesting, which makes it good. A bad card without interesting effects would just feel bad to play it. Regroup doesn't necessarily feel bad when you play it in certain scenarios. And Momentous Shift and Skirmish are very neat cards that can be shared by many decks because the dexterity of their effects can be applied to different thematic characters. And they create opportunities for clever players to make the best of small strategic decisions. And they don't sacrifice power for simplicity. And overall, the design choice to have several cards be shared by a number of decks makes card recognition and learning the game easier, which are all good things. However, none of these cards are very interesting by themselves, and they can make some decks feel samey, which is why almost none of these cards appeared in the 2 most recent sets, Jurassic Park or Cobble and Fog. And that makes the individual characters from those sets feel more different. My biggest criticism of the Battles of Legends Volume 1 pack is that a lot of times, if you play that set a lot of times in a row, the characters can feel very similar because they all share a handful of these basic cards. And with the huge colorful roster this game has, I want every single character I play to feel thematically unique and different. And when they do, that makes them generally more fun to play. If your Dracula feels very different from the Sinbad or the Alice, it can really highlight the strengths of your deck. And if you say, oh, that's really cool that this card works like that because that's like something that my character does, that's very interesting, and it makes the overall enjoyment of this game more heightened for me. Is that when decks feel different and the characters play differently, it's usually more interesting. So I hope the current trend of occasionally using these cards by sprinkling them into individual decks continues. Because as we saw, Skirmish is in Jekyll and Hyde, and Regroup is in Muldoon's deck, so they haven't completely abandoned these cards. But as the sets get more advanced, I would like to hope that the complexity also goes up, because players don't really need their hands held by simple to understand cards quite as often. So anyway, that was my video on basic cards. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any criticisms, comments, questions, please feel free to leave a comment. As someone pointed out in the last video, I actually made a mistake. I said Feint was in every single deck in the entire game, and that's actually not true. The Invisible Man doesn't have Feint cards. So even I am learning things about this game every single day. And if you would like to partake in a conversation with me, I would love to have that with you. The next video I will make will probably be about King Arthur, so stay tuned for that, and then I'll get into more of the Volume 1 Battle of Legends Volume 1 heroes shortly after that. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe. It's free. And have a nice day.